This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today I'm so delighted to have Ellis back with us. Evan, thank you so much for coming back to our show.
Thank you, Sandra. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
I have a few questions for you, just a few.
Okay.
Will the U.S. decouple, first of all, what is decoupling? What does that mean?
Sure. Well, what we see now is with increasing tension between the U.S. and China, with the emphasis on the risks coming from, for example, Chinese production of semiconductors, China's role, having Chinese companies in U.S. supply chains. Increasingly, on the U.S. side, there's been a desire to keep some of those risky Chinese companies out, and of course, on the Chinese side, a desire to basically extricate itself from dependence on the U.S. And so they refer to that as decoupling. What used to be an intertwined, interdependent global system is increasingly becoming, China trying to get the U.S. out of its system, especially in technology, and the U.S. trying to do the same. And so the idea is, as these two economies become intertwined, that could lead to changes in decision by different companies in terms of where they locate production facilities and things like that.
But I find so interesting as an article in the Times, or was it the Wall Street Journal, that said, "We Chinese welcome you back to investing in our stock market or our stock companies." Would you have a comment about that?
Absolutely. I mean, traditionally, the Chinese have always recognized the importance of Western investment and Western technology as a driver of their system. If you go back into the 1978, when you had the opening by Deng Xiaoping to the world, and especially in the 80s and 90s, when so much of Chinese development was Western companies, U.S. companies coming in, bringing their technology and helping to set up manufacturing facilities. And again, there was a debate in the United States that little by little, that engagement would make China more democratic and more open. By about 2000, those people who believed that had largely lost that debate in a sense that China was increasingly becoming a challenge that we had to manage. But clearly, China still continued to try to maintain positive relations with the United States because it understood that a loss of Western investment, a loss of Western technology would be damaging to it. Now, in recent years, especially with the increasingly aggressive policies of Xi Jinping in China, those tensions, I think, in China have come to be seen as almost inevitable. They understand that they have to go forward. For example, companies like Huawei understand that to get away from that dependence on U.S. technology in order not to be hurt, they have to reverse engineer U.S. chips and other things, out of their own, devices. And so certainly the Chinese wanted to get those resources and that technology for as long as possible. But understanding that our systems may be diverging, there's also a push of how do we do things alone as much as possible, both for us as well as for the Chinese.
Will U.S. decoupling from China lead to more investment in America, and what are the implications?
That's a great question, and certainly in parts of Latin America that have traditionally been very closely wed to the U.S. economy. So in Mexico under what used to be called NAFTA, and now USMCA, or Central America under the Central America Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA-DR, you have a lot of manufacturing that is oriented towards the U.S. market. And so as you had companies that used to have their manufacturing operations in China, the question is that as you pull away from China, would those companies now come to the United States? And there's two dimensions. One is the kind of the China risk dimension and the technology dimension, and another is the distance dimension. Because when we saw problems like the Ukraine war, and suddenly it was when shipping a container around the world went from being something reliable and about $2,000 a container to now something that can take months and months and be $20,000 plus a container. The idea of having these global supply chains suddenly started looking like a liability. Now, part of the problem, unfortunately, is that while there's a certain logical case to relocate some of that manufacturing to places like Mexico, where, frankly, labor costs in Mexico are not that much higher. In some cases are actually lower than they are in coastal China. But the problem is that our partners, especially the left of center government of Andres Manuel López Obrador in Mexico right now, has been pursuing policies that are just not that attractive to investors. They've tried to nationalize energy production, which is keeping energy costs high. They've tried to nationalize various other things. They've taken action against U.S. companies. They have taken certain protectionist measures with respect to corn and other products. Just recently, Mexico trying to woo Elon Musk to locate a Tesla production facility in Mexico. Logically, Musk wanted to locate it theoretically to the north of Mexico near the border in a state called Nuevo León, where a lot of the maquiladora industry is located. However, AMLO wanted him to locate the facility much more in the south of Mexico, which of course is good for the Mexicans because there's a need for jobs in those poor parts of the south of Mexico. The problem is that the south of Mexico, the infrastructure is not as good, the workforce is not trained as well, reliable access to some of the things that you might need for manufacturing might not be there. And so there's a lot of promise in nearshoring, but frankly, some of the political and policy orientations of the region, as well as issues such as corruption and violence and judicial insecurity, may make investors uncomfortable even while they do want to get away from
corruption
production
and violence is a big thing in South America.
It's
major.
And it's a big thing globally, but there are places in Latin America that are worse than others. I mean, Chile tends to still have relatively good governance. Even places like Colombia have relatively well-functioning institutions. But you certainly have, some countries in which levels of violence, and frankly, sometimes you have different levels of corruption in different areas. Where, if you're talking about narco trafficking, the judicial system is totally dysfunctional. But if you're talking about the resolution of a commercial dispute, it's partially functional. And so, some countries in Latin America have been living in that kind of dual functionality where at least the economic motors function just well enough. But it still continues to be a problem if those countries in the region want to attract the benefits of nearshoring.
Really a puzzlement. As China moves beyond zero COVID, what is the future of its engagement with Latin America?
That's a great question. So one of the things that's been much talked about is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, when you had China shutting down, when you had Latin America shutting down, a lot of the previous advances seemed to slow. So there was a fall off in the number of policy bank loans. There was a fall off in the number of big projects, and part of that was that because of China's own zero COVID policies, Chinese heads of state-owned enterprises and others couldn't travel over to the region to set up the big deals. The countries themselves, because of the economic and fiscal problems, couldn't take the deals forward. So there were a lot of things that were kind of frozen, and for a time people said, well, it looks like the China threat isn't as bad as we thought. However, what's beginning to happen now is a number of different things. It's a bit of the perfect storm. So on the one hand, there were a number of companies in China that wanted to wait and see until Xi Jinping was installed in his new unprecedented third term in office and got past some of the political maneuvering and anti-corruption campaign associated with that. So now he's in that third term. So now for big Chinese companies, there's at least a certainty of policy. They might not like it, but they know what the policy is and ready to move forward. There are also some very real financial problems. For example, in the real estate sector, big Chinese companies like Evergrande had some very serious debt problems. They're slowly moving forward with that. As you probably remember, with zero COVID, again, there was a fall off in Chinese demand and a lot of difficulty in moving forward with projects. Now that Chinese, for political internal reasons, abruptly dropped the zero COVID policies, but now that it's re-engaging, those policies themselves are beginning to re-engage Chinese demand for products from Latin America and elsewhere. And so what I see is that across the board you have more demand, more ability to do deals, more ability in Latin America to go forward with those deals. There's already talk that Gabriel Boric in Chile, Lula in Brazil, newly elected president there, is going to visit on March 28th. Suriname's president, Chan Santoki, probably will travel to the region this year. China has already reached out to try to buy portions of El Salvador's debt. You have two major new free trade agreements, one just completed between China and Ecuador, another that is in the works now between China and Uruguay. So there's a lot of things happening reflecting this new dynamic, and given that China has become a major purchaser of commodities in the region, as we've talked about, and because those interests by China are there and continuing to engage, I think we're really going to see this year an acceleration of some of those trends that begun during COVID, but were temporarily slowed by everything that happened with the pandemic.
What should the United States government do to respond to China's advance in Latin America?
That's another great question. And oftentimes, again, we get it wrong because our instinct is to say, don't work with the Chinese. But the problem is that Latin America's governments are sovereign governments, and our ability to stop governments from doing things that we find uncomfortable is limited, and frankly it would be counterproductive, because in Latin America oftentimes that anti-Chinese messaging is seen as just the gringos wanting to deprive Latin America of their right to have positive economic relationship. So for me there's several different pieces. Number one is what I say, shape the playing field, and so the importance of using our levers, our economic levers, our leverage through, for example, the Department of Treasury in terms of what are called OFAC sanctions, the State Department in terms of visa policy. There are a number of different instruments that we have that we can push for transparency in the dealings. So to stop those backroom deals in which basically Latin American elites sell out their country's interest to the Chinese. Also to insist on a level playing field, and so avoiding that the Chinese get special, unique deals. To have essentially rule of law, having open, transparent procurements. We can do certain things to help our Latin American counterparts to do that, to have a better evaluation of contracts, to have better evaluation at the technical level of competing proposals, so that you don't, you're not trying to compare apples and oranges, because in places like small Caribbean nations, for example, just the ability to evaluate contracts against massive Chinese companies like China Harbor or State Grid is just not there. And so there's those things that we can do, and that won't stop China from investing, but it'll help eliminate some of the more predatory investments. And then there are other things is supplements. Number one is the importance of more effective database communication about the relative performance of Chinese companies, about the relative amount of times in which they are successful, in which they have problems with project completion, in which they have problems with poor corporate social responsibility, poor adherence to local labor and environmental rules and things like that. And not just the United States and the State Department, but also getting the database out there for scholars in the region to be able to look at themselves and honestly have an informed debate about what is in the best interest of their countries. And frankly, the United States needs to fix some of the tools that we have that are broken. So, for example, things like the Development Finance Corporation, which is designed to essentially orient private sector investment to channel it for good alternatives to Chinese. We're a little bit confused in this country right now, especially in the current administration. We treat the Development Finance Corporation a little bit like USAID. We're trying to make it an organization that does good.
USAID? What's that?
Yeah. So one of the tools that the United States has to basically help the region, this goes back to the 1960s, is the U.S. Agency for International Development. And we use this to many things that we don't expect our Latin American counterparts to have to pay back. So education programs, programs to build capacity for starting new businesses, to meet basic human needs, education, pure drinking water, things like that. And so again, we have multiple different tools, and so at that level, we have a certain number of tools where we basically not only try to do good and be a good neighbor and meet the region's needs, but also help the region to prepare to do a good job in dealing competitively and wisely, with its citizens and others in a global market economy. And then at another level, you have Development Finance Corporation, which again is designed really to try to facilitate private sector money going into certain places that we believe it would be useful for it to go, to provide an alternative to China, among other things. The problem, however, is that it's one thing.
Also, another problem is, do they know when a project is coming on board? Do they have the first information? Do they have the same time information as the Chinese do? So they can even put their foot in the water.
Well, in that, there are a number of problems there. Yeah, number one is just making sure that our Latin American counterparts conduct these projects in a transparent way, so that companies know that there's a bid to compete and to participate in, and frankly, so that people in the region also are aware of the terms of deals. And so, oftentimes, what's happening with the Chinese is just a more predatory version of what's happened with many other actors, which is the elites of the region getting side benefits in side deals, and ultimately benefiting those elites, but not necessarily the country. And so, in many ways, for the deals to be conducted in such a way that the people can see what is being offered, what is being traded, to have that be part of a public debate is very important as well. And frankly, as well, and this was one of the criticisms of one of the other institution, the Inter-American Development Bank, the question of which companies know about a deal first. And so the previous head of the Inter-American Development Bank, Mauricio Claver-Caron, used to complain that the Chinese had done a really good job using their presence on the board of the bank. This is a bank that was supposed to put loans forth as alternative to Chinese funding, and yet the Chinese, by being on the board of this same bank, would often, and by creating something that was called co-financing funds, so a little bit of Chinese money, a little bit of bank money. So the Chinese were actually positioning themselves to know about and win these projects before other people could even get ready to do a competing bid. And so there's many different types of knowledge where having that knowledge and preparing our partners in the region to make effective decisions is very, very important. It won't stop the advance of the Chinese, but it will position the United States to be a better neighbor and a better partner, and will prevent some of the more predatory aspects. And it will help Chinese and other engagements occur in the context of a hemisphere in which the value of private markets, the value of rule of law, the value of a U.S. system that protects human rights and advances democracy is shown to the people, rather than it looking like there's a competition between that system and some sort of Chinese alternative, which ultimately does not serve, I would argue, the interests of the region.
By the way, what is Southcom?
Sure. So within the U.S. military, we have a different basically, there's different responsibilities for different parts of the world. It's not to manage, but just those military units that have responsibility for responding to situations, working with partners in these parts of the world. And so that portion of the U.S. military, which is oriented towards things that happen in basically everyone from the south of Mexico all the way down to Antarctica. That is called U.S. Southern Command, or for short, Southcom. And so Southcom is actually currently under the command of its first four-star female general, General Laura Richardson, who is a more than impressive person and very, very engaged on this topic, China, Latin America, as along with the rest of the team.
I understand she recently announced that we have Latin American governments with Russian arms to donate to Ukraine. I understand also we would replace them with more reliable equipment. How has the region responded, and why?
That's a great question. So this goes back to some regional purchases, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, again during the Cold War, but then after, because Russia, especially Rospron-Export and Rostec, Russia's arms exporting conglomerate and tech exporting conglomerate, marketed a lot of things like transport helicopters, some fighters, et cetera, to the region. And so about a quarter of the region's helicopter fleet, for example, are Russian helicopters. But what's happened is, especially now that Russia has shown itself to be a very unreliable partner, subject to a sanctions regime, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime in the future. So before the Atlantic Council, General Richardson said something which made a lot of sense. It was a win-win, as the Chinese like to say, which is, we understand that this isn't going to change anytime soon. You're having a lot of difficulties basically servicing and paying for maintenance of this Russian equipment. But if you don't pay for it, then a big chunk of your fleet is unusable, and as a military that hurts you. So why don't you Ukraine needs these Russian goods because they grew up on Russian equipment. That's what they know how to use. We want Latin America to do more to help Ukraine. So, if you donate your Russian goods to the Ukrainian effort, something that's good for Ukrainians, then we can provide U.S. goods in exchange, and so that will help and strengthen our U.S. Relationship with the region. It will get one hook for Russian relations with the region away. It will give Latin American militaries a more reliable basis because they don't have to worry about maintaining this equipment without busting sanctions. And so it was a win-win-win. The problem, unfortunately, is that the Latin American governments, especially Colombia, said no way with leftist government Gustavo Petro. Argentina and Brazil basically said don't even think about it. Certain other countries like Venezuela, it was never even an option, and certainly not Cuba. So Ecuador has seemed to be interested. So there's been a variety of responses, but it was a clever proposal, but thus far it hasn't yet gotten, unfortunately, the traction that it might have.
I'm wondering about the effect of all these. You mentioned family.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. There's a large proportion of South Americans with family in South America here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What effect might that have? Talk about Chinese leveraging family among Chinese in South America.
It's an interesting question, and it's something I think culturally that we in the United States, it's almost a bit un-American because we consider ourselves a nation of immigrants. We don't think of leveraging a American diaspora in some sense. But what you do find is that the Chinese are. The Chinese orientation is not, towards China as a territory or a government, but towards the Chinese civilization, the Chinese people, wherever they might be. And so it's interesting that although historically there was a time in early communist China in which those people who had left, during the Sun Yat-sen period and before the revolution, were seen as traitors, the Chinese, through things like ancestry tours, are actually beginning to more actively engage the Chinese diaspora for business, for security. I mean, that was what happened with the Chinese police stations, is thinking about, how can we, leverage and reach out to, these Chinese communities, at the very least to make sure that they are not doing harm and perhaps, bring them in certain ways in support of the broader, Chinese project. And so it's risky to start thinking that way. I mean, we remember Japanese internment camps in World War II, and so very dangerous for us to start thinking that anyone who is of Chinese ethnicity is a risk. But you do see that there is that interest by the PRC government in reaching out more and leveraging their people abroad.
Thank you, Evan. What would you like our audience to take away with them?
Once again, for me, the security of the region is intimately wed to the well-being of the United States. We are bound by geography. We are bound by investment in trades of commerce. There's no other region of the world in which we have more sunk investment in trade than Latin America. And as we see from immigration flows, as we see from the 100,000 plus drug deaths in the United States from drug flows, what happens in the region matters and deeply impacts the United States. And so that engagement with the region, whether it's about China or other topics, is vitally important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.